Recently, I was fascinated to see an article about a British scientist, Dr. Ian Pearson, who reckons that if you are under 40 right now, you are the first generation that will achieve immortality. Basically, he reckons that unless you die of some dreaded disease, you're not going to be dying of old age. And basically, what he's saying is that physical immortality is achievable for the generation under 40, certainly by the time we get to the year 2050. And that was an intriguing thought for me. And of course, and I'm sure as it does for you, it raises lots of interesting questions and debates. Immortality has always been the province really of religion. You know, in my many years in my world, where I've looked at all sorts of occult, new age, mystical and philosophical things, occasionally come across people who are working to achieve physical immortality. And I've always been a little bit intrigued as to why exactly would you want that and what other implications it might have. So I thought we'll address that topic since it seems to be back out there, but now from a scientific point of view. So the idea of immortality has essentially long been a promise of the world of religion. And in religion, depending on which religion, which era, immortality is something like an afterlife or reincarnation, or basically based around the idea of survival of death. And the whole idea of religious immortality is still that the physical body as we know it is lost or replaced, and the immortality that is promised is essentially an immortality of the soul. It has always intrigued me that in translation into non-religious spiritual movements, you see the abandonment really of the idea of the soul, and you see more of the idea of some kind of physical immortality that matches this scientific idea, or so-called scientific idea, that has been raised by Dr. Ian Pearson and others, where it's a reliance on technology and science and perhaps medicine to get us past the point of facing death. There are even some in the scientific world then who actually define death as a form of illness. It shouldn't happen. It's an unnecessary something going wrong, and we should be able to solve that problem. It is intriguing in terms of the spiritual frontier, and what has always intrigued me about that is that many people who claim that we are spiritual beings, they might believe in some form of karma or some form of reincarnation, very common beliefs in these modern spiritual kinds of movements, and yet this strong desire to achieve physical immortality seems to contradict the spiritual belief. It seems to say you need to hang on to this body, otherwise you will cease to exist. And so to me, I think it's not really often thought through enough that if you're going to postulate that we can achieve immortality without a physical body, you actually do have to have some kind of a religious framework. You have to have a belief system about what the human being is, or what the human experience is, that allows us to actually experience it beyond the physical body in some way, and allows us to explain a world beyond the physical body in some way. Whether you call that heaven or something else still remains. What is your belief system? It still remains essentially a type of a religious question. It's not only a religious question though. I mean, philosophers have debated endlessly about the question of immortality and the meaning of immortality, very often in those spiritual forms, but it also is the essential issue of the disparity or not between the mind and the body, known as the mind-body problem in philosophy, and the question of identity itself. Who is it that survives death? When we talk about survival of death, well, are we talking about the soul? Are we talking about the the identity as separate from the body? Well, it's physical immortality, as I said, that certainly interested Dr. Ian Pearson. And one of the things that causes him to go down this road is one of the many recent scientific discoveries about aging, and that is related to a particular enzyme called telomerase, which is an enzyme that helps build particular molecular structures called telomeres on the end of strands of DNA that basically control how often that DNA is able to reproduce. Little cap on the end of a piece of DNA that gets shorter every time the DNA replicates, and eventually it gets too short to attach itself to the end of the DNA, and that cell will die. So that is directly related to what causes aging and death. And the theory is, and some experiments have been done, of course, on mice as usual, that if you manage to prolong that slowing and shortening of the telomeres, and if you manage to somehow control the enzyme telomerase, which controls those telomeres, then you can avoid death, and you can prevent the cell endings from the DNA endings from getting shorter and shorter as time goes by. Essentially, this would make the cell immortal. So if you could increase telomerase and somehow control telomerase, then you can make a cell immortal. It's one of the options that someone like Dr. Ian Pearson suggests. Basically, his options about what will lead us to physical immortality firstly include that biotechnology and medicine are working to keep the body and rejuvenate the body and renew the body and many organs, perhaps even genetic engineering, and that will ultimately allow us to replace any body part that goes wrong, or control things like the enzyme telomerase, or any of those things that use the combination of medicine and technology to literally give the body the ability to persist. Well, that's one option. The second option that Pearson raises is to actually live in a robot body. He says the mind will be basically in the cloud, and you will be able to use any android that you feel like to inhabit the real world. So this means that the mind is then downloaded into a robotic body that could be any gender you like, it could be any age you like, and you could replace it with a different one. When you get tired of that particular body, you can just download your mind into some other body. Pearson actually reckons that we will be able to upload our minds into the cloud or onto a USB stick by the year 2050. It is worth pointing out, though, that other neuroscientists have pointed out themselves that the problem with that idea is the assumption that the mind and its contents are similar to digital data. And although we often use analogies between the mind and data, those analogies are not real. There are not megabytes of data in your brain, and the brain stores data in a way that is completely different to how mechanical data is stored, usually magnetically. And in fact, we don't entirely know how the brain stores data. So it does then mean that the idea of uploading or downloading really does make a whole bunch of other assumptions about who we are and what we are. It's one thing to say we can fix the problems of the body. That's kind of related to technology that we do understand. But to say that we can upload the mind is really like saying the soul reincarnates. It's entirely based on a belief system about what the mind is and what the mind does. Alternatively, says Pearson, something much closer to home, once we've uploaded the mind, even if we haven't mastered robotic bodies, which he reckons we will, but even if we haven't, we then have the option of just living in the virtual world and living in a virtual reality state where it's the world that keeps on changing all the time, not just our bodies that keep on changing. So some of you have probably experienced virtual reality, and that technology itself has an awful long way to go. But it kind of does give you a feel, if you have experienced it, of what Pearson is talking about and what might be possible. We've seen it in practically countless science fiction movies related to that topic of the experience of a virtual world as a real world, almost always leading to problems and trouble. So the underlying issue in both of those latter two options of Pearson is the assumption that electrical and chemical activity of the brain can be transferred onto silicon. I mean, there is another interesting question about that. If the brain were replicable as data or similar to data, well, then the other issue is, what about multiple copies? Copies of data are all identical to each other and indistinguishable from each other. There is no original anymore. And what would that say about what is identity? What is a person? If you were able to download yourself into more than one robot or into more than one virtual world, what if you did them more than one at a time? Which one becomes the real person? Does the real identity still exist? There are also other possibilities. So maybe life itself and consciousness are not actually related to that. That's another whole bunch of assumptions that are made. Certainly, we don't know what makes living cells alive. We don't really understand that. And so the issue in talking about the brain and its contents as data includes these other assumptions that say, well, you'll also be alive. There are those who say, actually, you'll just be a zombie. You'll look like you, or you'll look like your robotic version of you, but you will really be a zombie, not a person. You won't have awareness, and you won't be conscious. You might be functionally identical, look, talk, walk in the same way if consciousness alone has been transferred, but you're not really the same as an actual person. I mean, the opposite argument exists. There are many in the world of biology and science who say the human being is reducible to the processes and contents, especially of the brain, and the other physical processes not really relevant for this conversation. So if you are reducible to the processes and contents of your brain, then a copy of that will not be able to be anything but yourself. If you are entirely chemical processes and data, then replicating that cannot produce anything but yourself. So that's the argument. Is it you, or is life and consciousness something else, and it's a zombie? Of course, underlying that argument is, well, this is all on the assumption, of course, that we solve the problem in the first place of either keeping the body going and fixing it, or treating the mind as separate. And to me, Pearson's arguments don't sound that convincing. There is another very interesting side to that story, and that is that says, who gets to be immortal? There's absolutely no doubt that that will cost a lot of money. So physical immortality of whatever kind it forms will become available only to the rich or even the super rich. And so the idea of inequality, the idea of the separation between rich and poor, takes on proportions and implications that have never been conceived of. Not only would it only be available to the rich, but certainly it will be those people who are able to get the process will probably do anything in order to keep that right. Immortality might be one of the most powerful currencies ever available, and so what would you do to get it or to keep it? There's some other issues that perhaps are more pragmatic but also need to be thought about, and that would be, what would be the benefit really of living forever? Eventually, would this not become increasingly difficult to keep up with the world and understand it, which we do experience as we age? We feel ourselves usually increasingly separate from how things go on. We find things difficult to relate to and difficult to understand. And that problem would only increase. Certainly fiction with zombies and vampires who live so long doesn't really reflect that terribly well, but that's a real life problem, that maybe an infinitely long life becomes a life of infinite futility. Telomerase is also one of the things that helps cancer keep going. One of the reasons that cancer cells can spread so widely and reproduce themselves and seem not so willing to die is because they use telomerase to grow in an uncontrolled way. So increasing telomerase in the body or giving to the body in some way is actually likely to cause cancer. Yes, indeed, Dr. Pearson. Dr. Pearson doesn't seem to remember that cancer or not, we're likely to die from disease. Pearson does say if you don't die from disease, you could live forever. Well, what else do we die from? Mostly, sooner or later, something overpowers you health-wise. So it might be fine to look after those telomeres and extend all the physical processes about the body, but then there's illness. So maybe a better prospect exists, maybe a more realistic prospect than immortality exists, and maybe we should be talking about longevity. Longevity is about living longer and better, living longer healthier, making better use of your time on earth by extending it in a positive, healthy, functional way. So improving the capacity to live long certainly seems to us that we live very much longer than people have before, and we now see people living well into their 80s and beyond, often still in command of their senses, and to some extent it's the body that needs the work. So how can we actually improve our longevity? Because that's something that is available to us. So between them, experts agree on a few things that will really help increase the quality and quantity of your years on earth, and that's something that's reachable for all of us. We don't have to be under 40, we don't have to wait for technology, science and maybe other weird things to catch up with them. So here's what we've found so far about longevity. Firstly, experts do like to point out that what we are looking for is not necessarily an entirely cheerful old age. It is true that the first condition mentioned, and these are not necessarily in any particular order, but the first condition mentioned for a good, healthy, long life is to laugh often and smile often. There's absolutely no doubt that it reduces stress and it feels good and certainly goes a long way to improve longevity. So number one is laughing, but the caveat in that, we're not looking for absolute optimistic cheerfulness. It's often thought that being cheery and optimistic and easygoing to a huge extent is one of the things that helps longevity, and studies have proved that the opposite is true. That people who tend to worry a bit more tend to survive longer, and that is because people who are a little bit worried tend to be more alert. They notice things going on around them, and most importantly, they notice changes in their bodies, which optimistic people often don't. They often ignore it and think, it'll go away, or it's nothing. And while that often is true, if you're trying to live for a very long time, you might miss something that's really important. So yes, be optimistic, but be alert, and don't worry if you're worried about those small things in your body. Turns out that helps with longevity. Another one is sleeping enough. Experts have shown that we need an absolute minimum of 7 hours, but what we've always been told is true. We all need 8 hours of sleep a day, and with those 8 hours of sleep, longevity improves. Number 3 is diet. Well, we've all wondered what is the magic diet. We hear about the Mediterranean diet. All of those kind of dietary things, well, there's never been any proof that one is any better than any other. The only dietary advice that has been associated with longevity, 2 things in terms of diet have been associated with longevity. Number 1 is everything in moderation. Isn't that an old chestnut that still holds true? And number 2, to do with diet, is eat until you are 80% full. Eat until you're 80% full, not 100% full. Keep yourself a little bit hungry. The body functions best on slightly reduced calories. That has also led to the explorations of various kind of detox methods, and importantly, fasting as another way of extending life. And that's such a big and current topic that we're actually going to devote a show to that. So be sure to watch next week when I interview an expert on fasting who will help us understand why and maybe what we can do to improve our life using what's learned from fasting. So, even though it turns out that everyone over 100 surveyed definitely has breakfast every day, but that seems to be routine is good for us. Number 4 is to have a pet. Well, pet lovers know that having someone to love and who loves you back unconditionally is an incredible release of stress and loneliness. Because, number 5, loneliness is an issue. So spending times with friends and family. The research shows that friends and strangers are often better than family in terms of dealing with loneliness. It's not true for everyone, but of course our family can often be critical and be disparaging, or they kind of know us too well, and sometimes we treat our elders a little bit casually when we shouldn't. But friendships which are based on mutual love and exchange, as well as doing voluntary work, mixing with strangers and friends, significantly improves the quality and quantity of life. So does having sex twice a week. So no matter how old you get, try and keep that on your agenda, and you're doing well to improve in the longevity stakes. But seventhly, any kind of activity is. So being active. It's not necessarily rigorous exercise, but the research shows that actually all you need is a little bit of activity. A minimum of 15 minutes, even if it's just walking, makes a huge difference to lifespan. Number 8 is having a sense of purpose and being productive. Very handy to have something to focus on and feel that you're doing something constructive. Can be absolutely anything. Even crocheting a blanket is a sense of purpose. So it doesn't have to be something big and important. Something to focus on, something to do, lifespan increases. The ones that I like the best have always been there for me. Number 9 is meditation. People who meditate increase their lifespan, reduces stress, changes your attitude on the world, helps you be positive without being cheerfully optimistic too much. So that's one of those. Number 10 is eat more dark chocolate. That one really works for me. And number 11, drink a little bit more red wine. It's certainly true that a small amount of alcohol every day seems to extend lifespan more than abstention does. Isn't there a thought? But finally, number 12 on my list, perhaps one of the most important things is having something to believe in. Not being in a situation where it's easy to lose hope or despair. Whether it's your religious beliefs or whether it's your beliefs about your world, your culture, your family, having something to believe in. Well, really, beyond your world and your culture, having something to believe in means there is something bigger than yourself. Whether it's a religious belief, whether you develop it out of philosophy, whether you relate it to the human race as a whole, that's the one that really makes us understand. I don't need to be physically immortal to understand that I actually am more than a physical body. And as soon as I start understanding that, I'm on the road to understanding what does it mean to live forever. Because physical immortality, quite frankly, is not only selfish, but has other issues. What about resources? How about the food on the planet and the water on the planet and population? All those issues are things that we need to think about. And of course, physical immortality then does sound selfish and clearly doesn't seem to be that much of an error of nature. For me, spirituality is about understanding that the physical reality is not the ultimate reality. That if you're seeking physical immortality, you're too focused in the physical world, the material world, and your sense of yourself as only this identity. But in reality, there is more to you. So work on number 12, find something to believe in. Realize there's more to you than just your physical life. whatever that may be. You don't have to find a religion. There are lots of ways to explore that, and that will help you understand what it means to be immortal. And ultimately, the most old-fashioned way to achieve immortality is do something for which you'll be remembered. Leave a legacy. That's immortality. Well, lots of interesting things to think about there. Don't forget to join me next week when I'll be with my guest discussing fasting and how that might relate to extending life and health, what you can do about that, and of course a fascinating topic every week. Be sure to like the Facebook page to find out what's coming next, and I'll see you here next Friday at the same time.